Hello everyone and welcome to the Backmarkers F1 Show channel and welcome to our Day 3 debrief show of 2023 F1 preseason testing. I'm your host Chris Cato, and in this show we're going to be breaking down all of the action from the final day of testing here in 2023, but also just a general recap of the 3 days of running in Bahrain. We've got plenty to get to and a lot of action that happened today, both in the AM and PM session. So let's get right into it. And as you can see there on your screen, the fastest lap of the day in day 3, but also just overall in general, goes to Sergio Perez in the Red Bull, a 1:30.3 that he set in the final hour of running. But before we get to some of the action in the PM session, we're going to take you back into the morning session because a lot of events transpired in the AM that was very important to note as well. Charles Leclerc was the fastest man out on track in the morning with a 1:31.0. He set that on the C4 tire, while George Russell behind him in the Mercedes set that on the C5 tire, 4/10 off of Leclerc's best time. Now, if we look at some of the lap counts of drivers in that AM session, it was a very busy one for Nyck de Vries. 87 laps completed in the AlphaTauri. AlphaTauri was mainly working on race simulation runs and a very healthy lap count for Nyck de Vries. George Russell close behind by 83 laps. Felipe Drugovich was in the car this morning for Aston Martin, completing 77 laps. But if you look down further in that list, it was another troublesome morning for Oscar Piastri and the McLaren team in general, because once again, McLaren did have the same problems as they did on day 1. They had issues with the front wheel deflectors, and they were trying to get those fixed, and they had to spend quite a bit of time in the garage getting that issue really sorted out there. But unfortunately, it led to Oscar Piastri missing out on a lot of running there. As you can see, Oscar Piastri only completing 44 laps in that AM session, and his day was done afterwards because Lando Norris took over in the afternoon. But more on Oscar Piastri. When he did get out onto track, he was one of the first cars to actually have a spin here in testing, and it was quite the dramatic one as he went down into turn 10, just went over a bump and ended up bottoming out, and ended up catching the spin quite nicely actually and avoiding the barriers on the exit of turn 10. But it really was a difficult day for McLaren, even so in the PM session, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes time. But not the ideal start for Oscar Piastri's Formula One career. He was in deep discussion with his manager Mark Webber in the garage while his car was being worked on, and then not so smooth as well when he went out onto the track. So that was the morning there for Oscar Piastri and McLaren. Now further down, the issues didn't stop there because we had a brief red flag that was eventually caused by Sergio Perez, but it wasn't nothing too dramatic. The session was briefly red flagged to retrieve a sensor strip that had fallen off of Sergio Perez's car. Nothing major there, and of course Perez was in the car all day today. He had the day to himself, and no major issues there on the Red Bull RB19. But we did get some major issues later on in the session for the Alfa Romeo of Valtteri Bottas. He was doing a lot of great running until then and was leading the lap count for the morning until his Alfa Romeo came to a halt on the exit of turn 6 and then 7. It is suspected some sort of a gearbox or engine issue, and it forced Valtteri to have to pull over at the exit of turn 8, and unfortunately his session was done at that point. But some sort of a mechanical failure on that Alfa Romeo C43. His teammate Zhou Guanyu on day 2 had some gearbox issues in the AM session and some technical gremlins at night as well. So not something that you want to see from Alfa Romeo, especially considering the reliability issues that they had last season. So he showed some good pace today, which we're going to get to shortly. But reliability seems to be somewhat of a concern there for Bottas and Alfa Romeo still. And just finally, before we move on into the PM session, a lot of teams in the morning and throughout the day were trialing different wing setups. Now, as you see in this photo here, you had a lot of different wing setups, but a lot of teams opting to go for a lower downforce setup to improve speed and reduce drag, especially on the Alpine. Alpine opted for a low drag setup there, and it ended up working out pretty well for them. You see Pierre Gasly ended the session in 5th place with his time there, but other teams ended up going a different route. For example, Mercedes maintained the high downforce rear wing for most of the session and into the PM as well, versus others like Alfa Romeo and Aston Martin opting to go for the mid to high downforce setup. And on the big teams, we saw Ferrari eventually switch to a lower downforce rear wing, and they actually had an issue with the DRS actuator on their higher downforce rear wing, which is part of the reason why they ended up doing the change. But the lower rear wing for Ferrari really seemed to help them because they ended up topping the speed traps at 328 kilometers an hour. So those were some of the rear wings and setups that teams were trialing during that AM session. Now, as we get into the PM session, night fell on the Bahrain International Circuit, and this was the interesting part of day 3 that many people were waiting for, as a lot of drivers were doing soft tire runs, particularly at the end of the session, to get a little bit more of an idea of the pure pace of some of these cars, keeping in mind that we don't know the fuel loads and the ERS deployment modes for some of these teams. So these aren't necessarily 100% representative of what we'll see at the end of Q3 a week from now, but it certainly gives you an idea of which cars have some pace in the pocket. And certainly Sergio Perez in the RB19 has plenty of pace. Not only did he do 133 laps on the day, he also completed the fastest time of the day with a 1:30.3, and it ended up being the fastest in testing altogether. You had Lewis Hamilton in P2, not that far behind, 3.5 tenths off of his pace, and Valtteri Bottas eventually did recover from those technical issues earlier on in the day and put in a solid lap at the end there to finish in 3rd place. Charles Leclerc in the Ferrari, his time from the morning still stood, finished P4 on the day. His teammate Carlos Sainz ended up 5th as well. And Yuki Tsunoda, finally giving us some performance runs in that AlphaTauri, ended up finishing in 6th place as well. Further issues, though, for McLaren, as you can see in that standing there. Lando Norris down in 11th place, only completed 47 laps, so really some of the fewest laps done there by Lando Norris and McLaren. And here we can see the most laps completed by each team in 2023 F1 testing, and it is AlphaTauri leading the way, which isn't all that surprising because typically they do end up running a lot of laps in previous testing seasons as well. 456 laps completed for AlphaTauri, Williams 439 under their belt, a really strong preseason testing for Williams this season. 417 for Ferrari in 3rd, 415 for Haas, Red Bull the 5th most laps completed with 413, 402 for Alfa Romeo, Mercedes only completing 398 laps, Aston Martin 387, although Fernando Alonso is the leading driver with the most laps completed out of any driver in testing, and then the 9th most laps completed for Alpine, 353, and the fewest laps of 2023 F1 testing goes to McLaren, only at 312. So slightly concerning there if you are a McLaren fan. Now, as we get into some other drivers as well, we had Fernando Alonso in the Aston Martin doing a lot of long runs on day 3 of F1 testing and as well at night, really trying to simulate the race conditions as best as they can. And there's some great news coming from the pit lane. This is from Albert Fabrega, who spent the entire testing walking up and down the pit lane, giving us the scoop directly from the teams and from the garages. And he says Alonso's Aston Martin race simulations confirms low degradation and good pace. The step forward is clear for Aston Martin this season. So it seems like some of the hype around Aston Martin is true, some expecting them to be as quick as Mercedes in the beginning, and they look like they have a really good package underneath them in 2023. He did quite a long stint on the C2, that was the hard tire. He did about, I would say 20 or 21 laps on that tire as well, and then went out for some medium runs as well at night. Didn't do so much performance runs, did Alonso, as he did the first 2 days, but good long run pace confirmed there for Aston Martin. Let's do a very interesting comparison between the fastest 2023 F1 testing times versus the fastest 2022 Bahrain Grand Prix qualifying times. And this will kind of really confirm to you guys just the leap in progression Aston Martin has made on their AMR 23, because they are 1.3 seconds quicker in 2023 testing than they were at this time in qualifying last season. So an excellent progression made. Now keep in mind that some of these are on different tire compounds. Not every single one of these teams ran the softest compound for their fastest times, but we do have significant progression made by Aston Martin. Alfa Romeo is also 7 tenths quicker already than they were last season. Mercedes have made some improvements, 3 tenths quicker on themselves. Red Bull as well, the defending world champions, 3 tenths quicker from their qualifying lap in 2022. Alfa Romeo and Williams and Haas, the rest of the three teams that made slight progressions on their qualifying times. The only teams that are slower are Ferrari, McLaren, and Alpine. Again, keeping in mind different run plans, running harder tires as well for some of those teams, but very interesting comparison to see that a lot of these 2022 cars will actually also be quicker than they were in 2022. And also that has a lot to do with the fact that a majority of these teams are actually finally under the weight limit as the season begins, versus last season when many of them were heavily over the weight limit. Red Bull in particular were 20 kilograms over the weight limit as the lights went out in Bahrain. So an interesting comparison there. All right, well, that wraps up day 3 and most of the majority of winter testing. But before we go, let's talk a little bit about some of the winners and the losers for 2023 testing. And I must say that some of the winners you have to include would be teams such as Red Bull, Aston Martin, and I'll throw Williams in there as well. Williams in particular, not so much for some of the pace that they've shown, but just because of the amount of laps that they were able to complete. They completed the second most laps at 439, and that is a big win for Williams, considering it wasn't that long ago that they'd showed up to testing without even a car ready. So I think Williams had a really solid test, particularly for rookie Logan Sargent, had plenty of laps under his belt. That Williams looks a little less wind sensitive than in previous years. Whether it has the outright pace to fight for regular Q2s or Q3s, we will find out eventually. But I think Williams a good winner there. Aston Martin as well certainly has to be in the winners category for the pace that they've shown under Fernando Alonso, and long run pace as well is very good for them. So Aston Martin certainly a winner. Wish they would have gotten some more laps up in there with 387. They had a few issues here and there throughout the 3 days of testing, but they were put in a difficult position with Lance Stroll's injury. So they made the most of it, and their reserve driver Felipe Drugovich was a big help in the end. And then, of course, it's hard not to include Red Bull in that conversation as well, with Max Verstappen going quickest on the first day, Sergio Perez on the third day. Just a really healthy amount of laps done for Red Bull as well. They're in the top 5 with most laps completed at 413, and they really lit up the timesheets as well. But also just the RB19 on track looks the best and looks like it is the car to beat so far in the early stages of the year. Now, I'd say some losers of testing, you definitely have to put McLaren in that conversation as well. Really didn't show much in terms of pace as well, but that was mostly due to the fact that they spent a lot of time fixing issues in the garage. Only 312 laps completed, and you also had their CEO, Zach Brown, coming out and admitting that they've missed their development targets so far for this season. Upgrades are in the pipeline, but it should be a difficult start to their season. Now, I'd also say a loser for 2023 testing has to be Mercedes. I mean, it's not typical to see Mercedes in the bottom 5 of most laps completed for winter testing, but they are down there, only 398. They were one of the teams to have a major mechanical issue. George Russell on day 2 in the PM session ended up breaking down with a hydraulic failure. So I think it was disappointing from Mercedes. It wasn't as clean as they would have hoped for, and I think that they're maintaining the zero side pod concept hasn't necessarily worked out for them, because again, some people are even expecting Aston Martin to be able to challenge them. So I'd include Mercedes in there as well. And AlphaTauri as well. Even though they completed the most laps, they really didn't show much in the way of short run pace, and also even in their long run pace. If you look at the data and the telemetry, particularly from F1 data analysis on Twitter, they were one of the slower cars out there and just didn't really show us great pace at times throughout testing. And I'd also include some unknowns in there. I wouldn't say positive or negative, but just teams that we're not really sure where they are at this point. Alpine has to be one of the biggest ones, because they did a decent amount of running, but only good enough for the second last amount of laps completed with 353. But they never really showed really true pace. They never did any great soft tire runs that would have seen any of indication of what Alpine's pace is like. The highest that they finished on the day 3 classification was Pierre Gasly in 12th place, Esteban Ocon down in 14th. So Alpine still seems pretty confident, and maybe they're just holding their cards close to their chest, but it's just unknown where they are at this point. And the same goes for Haas. We've seen some good long-run data gathering from Haas throughout the 3 days, and some bursts of space. Kevin Magnussen in 7th place. Nico Hülkenberg was in the top 10 on day 1 as well, but we're just not exactly sure where Haas is. 415 laps completed is solid though, 4th most out of any team, and it was relatively trouble-free as well. So those are some of the winners, some of the losers, and some of the unknowns as well as we head into the first race of the season. But that's going to do it, guys, for this debrief show, and that's going to do it for the 2023 F1 preseason testing. The next time we do go racing in Bahrain, it will be for real for the first round of the 2023 championship, and we hope that you guys will join us then. Of course, subscribe to the Backmarkers F1 Show channel for wall-to-wall coverage of the 2023 season, podcasts, analysis videos, race previews, and much more coming on the way. Thank you very much to everybody for watching, and thanks for everybody who joined for our 3 days of testing live streams. We thoroughly enjoyed it, and I thoroughly enjoy the return of Formula One. We'll see you guys soon. Thank you.